As we head into the holiday season, we are replaying some of your favorite episodes from 2024. Thank you so much for joining Reproductive Rebel for season 3. And this week, one of your favorite episodes was the technocratic approach to women's health, where I sat down with the amazing Kristin Hauser and we talked about how women's health is looked at and regulated from a technocratic approach. Join us for this week's episode, and thank you for listening to Reproductive Rebel.
Hi, I'm Adrienne Irizarry. I'm an Eastern medicine practitioner who is passionate about women's health and helping women live their best lives. My goal is to put you in the driver's seat of your menstrual health, offering period solutions for a symptom-free life. Statements made in this program are for educational purposes only and not intended as a substitution for medical consultation or advice. We do not claim to diagnose, treat, or cure any diseases. This podcast is inclusive and welcomes all gender identities. The focus of the program is on biological function, and we will use the term women throughout, but it is referencing physiological and social challenges for biology, not identity. Come as you are, I am happy you're here and welcome all performances of identity. I hope you find something helpful in this show.
Welcome back to another episode of the Reproductive Rebel podcast. I'm really excited to introduce you to Kristin Hauser. She is a fellow TCM practitioner. I'm so excited to have her on the show today. Welcome, Kristin.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Are you ready to rewrite the story your body's been carrying? Rebel Remembered is a transformational journey for every woman who's felt disconnected, silenced, or weighed down by period pain, fertility challenges, or the shifting tides of perimenopause and menopause. Led by the reproductive rebel, Adrienne Irizarry, this program weaves together goddess archetypes, body literacy, and the ancient healing art of sound. Here, you will find freedom in your body, reclaim joy, and release the intergenerational trauma that no longer serves you. Sister, it is time to remember your strength. Join Rebel Remembered and awaken the rebel within. Information about joining this transformational program is in the show notes. And now, back to the show. So I've been following you for a while, and I absolutely love what you put out on Instagram. But share with our audience a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, of course. So I'm Kristin Hauser. I'm a mom of 3, and I'm pregnant with my 4th currently. I'm also an acupuncturist and herbalist, and I've been doing that work for just over a decade now. And my work really revolves around supporting women fertility through postpartum. So along the way, I've picked up some other skill sets, including somatic sex education and really nervous system regulation skills as well. So I incorporate that into my work, as well as pelvic care. So I've done a lot of different things, but most of what I do is really centered around the reproductive years, so fertility through the postpartum time.
One of the things that made me reach out to Kristin, like I said, I've been following her for quite some time on social media. She had done this amazing video that talked about how birth control makes people blood deficient. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's another practitioner talking about it the same way I do. So I reached out and I invited Kristin onto the show. And I loved the fact that you made that connection with birth control, because a lot of people really don't understand the depth of what that pharmaceutical does to our body. And so when Kristin and I sat down to have our initial conversation about, so what do we want to talk about on this episode, we were looking at the technocratic approach to women's health, which is totally a hill I'm going to die on. So I was really excited that she wanted to have this conversation with me.
But let's talk a little bit about birth control. What are you seeing in your work in terms of the way that birth control is essentially showing up in the body?
Yeah. So a lot of women, at least where I'm at now in my practice, a lot of women kind of find me after they've had their birth control experience, or they know they want to come off birth control, or maybe they've already done that, but now a lot of their period symptoms return and they're like, well, what am I going to do now? I don't want to go back on birth control, but I do need to heal. So that's what I kind of see a lot now. But over the years, I've seen birth control used in a lot of different settings because I've also worked with a lot of women who are going through assisted reproductive technology, and they actually use birth control to sort of suppress the hormonal system in different parts of that experience, right? So, what I've been tracking over the years, and what I've also had the lived experience of, because I also used birth control for about a 6 month time period, was that okay, so we're taking hormones from the external environment, bringing them into our internal environment. They're not bioidentical. So the body does have to process that, but they do have impact. So what happens is the body starts to recognize, oh, there are hormones. I don't need to work towards creating hormones anymore, right? So that downregulates some of the signals from the brain to the ovaries. And that also changes what I think a lot of people maybe don't think about is that also changes how the ovaries might receive their blood flow because they're just not really working. They're not as important in those months where you're on the hormonal contraceptives. And of course, there are a lot of different types of hormonal contraceptives out there and available now. So I'm speaking primarily to just what we would consider like a typical pill that you're taking. I'm not talking about like Depo or some type of shot or even the implant now, although those are taking it sort of to a next level in a lot of ways. But now there's a lot of research that shows that when you're on these hormonal contraceptives, they interfere with the gut microbiome, they change the way we assimilate our nutrients, and they overall decrease our B vitamins. And at least the way that translates into Chinese medicine is that decreases our capacity to make blood. We see that reflected in the cycle because, of course, when you're on hormonal birth control, you're not having an actual cycle. You're having like a breakthrough bleed when you stop the medication or you stop at least the hormonal part of the medication. And so you do get some shedding of the uterine lining. For most women, that becomes very light or at least lighter when they're on hormonal contraceptives versus when they're not. So we're already seeing as TCM practitioners like, oh, they're already becoming a bit blood deficient. Like the amount of blood they're making in their uterine lining is decreasing. So we have that. Then I think you have to watch over time because some women are on hormonal contraceptives for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years.
Yeah.
And that's a very long time. And so for what these women are experiencing over the course of time is this depletion of essential vitamins, essentially, and I would say minerals to some degree too. And we just can't make as much blood when we don't have those things. It's very simple, both from the TCM point of view and understanding biomedicine. If we're not getting the nutrients from our food, that we can't make energy, we can't make blood cells, all of those things. So this shows up in a lot of different ways, but it can show up as just like general fatigue, decreasing energy levels, kind of like a lackluster attitude towards life, or just overall apathy. It also shows up in the skin a lot or the hair. So the hair growth might slow down or there might be more shedding. The nails might change in their consistency or texture or growth rate. And those are signs we look for as TCM practitioners of like, oh, we need to really nourish blood. And of course, there are ways to do that without stopping the hormonal contraceptive. But what often happens, at least in the work that I do, is women are like, oh, yes, I'm kind of realizing this is probably not the best path for me. Or maybe they want to conceive. So they're finally like, oh, I just want to stop hormonal contraceptives for that reason. Well, then we enter into this period where we need to rebuild their blood supply. And I think it's important to note here too, like this might not show up on a standardized sort of complete blood count situation. It could. There could be an iron issue or some other issue that shows up on that, but it might not manifest in that way. So as TCM practitioners, we're tracking a lot of different metrics, not just what we see on a lab value, but also how's the person's complexion, like what are they experiencing day to day? How has their body composition changed when they were on hormonal contraceptives, if that has been an issue for them? And just overall, especially if they are transitioning off of hormonal contraceptives, how are their periods changing? What's showing up now? And that can tell us a lot and sort of guide the way we support that. But there is a phase, I would say, of rebuilding blood that needs to happen as you transition off of hormonal contraceptives. Another woman who does great work around this is Lisa Hendrickson Jack, and she wrote a book. And in that book, she talks about how it takes really 18 months, according to research, to really reestablish a regular cycle, a robust cycle that where you have optimal fertility after transitioning from hormonal birth control. And of course, many women will conceive within months or even 1 month of stopping hormonal birth control. And we need to recognize that that doesn't mean their fertility was optimal in that moment. It doesn't mean they will have a bad pregnancy or a bad outcome or anything like that. It just means typically if we want to reach optimal fertility and like full recovery from hormonal contraceptives, I think you need at least a year.
Yes, I completely agree with you. And the conversation that most people have with their doctor is go off of it 1 month, and as soon as you have your cycle, you can start trying. And
Yeah, that's the
it
standard for
it
sure.
it totally sets people up for frustration. Like, yes, like you said, there are absolutely some people who get pregnant right off of it, but that's not the story for the majority of people. And it really sets us up to follow the obstetric model, the way that it's outlined to us today. You try for 6 months. Okay, so if we're looking at it from a I want to try to conceive standpoint, the guideline is if you've had unprotected sex for 6 months and it hasn't resulted in a pregnancy, now it's time to explore fertility issues. And then you go
Hmm.
into that model and they start doing diagnostics. And, there are so many women that end up with that kiss of death label of unexplained infertility. And that's actually what drove me into doing the work that I do now and moving towards Chinese medicine is the fact that there is an explanation.
Yeah. Yeah.
There is an explanation. Chinese medicine has lots of explanations as to why somebody might be struggling with their fertility. It's just not measured in the same way that you might with I had a blood test, your iron levels look fine.
Yeah, totally. And I think what at least a lot of women who I've worked with over the years, it's like you start to, let's say you perceive that you're struggling with your fertility, or you actually are, and it's been a while of trying to conceive, whatever the situation is. And then they think, okay, well, I'm going to go to my gynecologist. But gynecologists actually aren't specialized in fertility. It's kind of strange in that setup. It's like you think, okay, here's the person who helps me with my reproductive health, with I need to get the pap smear. That's where I got the hormonal contraceptive or whatever the thing was. Or if I think I have a bleeding issue, that's who I go to. But some, of course, have a skill set in fertility, but most don't. And most will maybe run some basic testing and then they'll refer you to a reproductive endocrinologist. And so then once you're in that sort of area, you're going to the specialist, so reproductive endocrinologist specializing in infertility, and you're going through, like you said, this kind of set of testing, and they have their sort of tests that they do. And even then, you could still come up against that framework of, oh, it's unexplained infertility. And what that means, it doesn't really mean anything, but a lot of people really internalize that, of course. It just means they don't know why it's not working, but it doesn't mean there's not a reason why it's not working. So those are two very different things. And it's really, really important, especially if you are going to engage with reproductive technology at all, just a little bit, or you're not interested at all. But if you're going to engage with that system, even just for testing, you really have to differentiate. Okay, they're saying one thing and that's the way they are labeling it, but I don't have to actually take that into my consciousness or like take that on. This is just one particular point of view.
I think that's a really excellent point. You described a lot of the early stages of my challenges around infertility. I had had one very successful pregnancy and home birth, and it was beautiful. And yes, I absolutely had a rough postpartum recovery, but it had been several years, and I had been taking care of my body and not on contraception when my husband and I decided that we were going to try to have a baby of our own. And that's exactly what happened. We ended up escalated to the reproductive endocrinologist, and the guy laughed in my face and was like, "Your test results are fine. His are fine. I have no idea why you're having this problem, but we can do IVF with ICSI." And then walked out of the office. And I was like,
Yeah.
I don't even know what that is. And I had a heart attack on birth control when I was 25. So, like, can you like sit down for a second and talk to me about, can I even have this medication? Like, I don't even know.
Wow.
And so many people find themselves in that situation, and the IVF journey can be, and is for so many people, very heartbreaking, frustrating, exhausting emotionally as
Yeah.
well as physically. Like, you're taking on a lot when you step into going the IVF route. And so something that's really near and dear to my heart, and that's a big part of why this program exists, is to raise awareness around the fact that there's actually a lot of stops on that bus before you even have to go there. You just might not be doing it through your traditional standard of care Western model.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, of course, it sounds like you had a lot of skill set to fall back on, or I don't know if you studied Chinese medicine after or before. I assume it was before, secondary infertility, which is its own whole thing. It's
Mhm,
very, very frustrating because it's confusing. It's
mhm.
primarily, it's disorienting and confusing. It worked and now it doesn't. It doesn't make sense why. What am I going to do about it situation, right? So
Exactly.
that's a lot for someone who, if you're going through that, I really have a lot of empathy for that situation. And it sounds like in your particular situation, you at least had the insight to be like, okay, well, let me at least regroup and consider what my options are. And I think a lot of women don't. They don't. It's not that they're not smart or whatever. Like, there's not judgment around that. It's just once you get in that trajectory, they have that particular model. And there's a lot of great people working in that industry, but it is also very fast paced. It is very intense. It's very protocol focused.
Mhm,
And a lot of the healthcare workers in that environment are working really long hours. Sometimes the clinics are open all the,
mhm,
Saturdays and Sundays too, because you might need to do a transfer that day or a retrieval or whatever. So they're working in a pretty high stress environment and they're sort of bringing you into that system. And it is very activating and it is very taxing physically, emotionally, and on all levels financially for a lot of families. And it's not really sustainable. I'm not saying it doesn't work in certain situations. Of course it does. But I do think there's always some type of price to pay. Some people go into that and they're very willing to pay the price, and I totally respect that. And I would say the majority of people go into it and they don't know what the price is. They
mhm,
might know what the financial price is, but they don't know what the longer impact of their decision is.
mhm. I would agree with that. I would agree with that. And I feel like there's a lot to our current care model, and when I say this, I'm saying it from more of an allopathic perspective that's all about control, right? We quote unquote, and I'm using air quotes, control our cycle with birth control. And then we try to control the parameters afterwards. And there's control, like all
Mhm.
this technology creates a level of control over something that isn't energetically that way,
Right. Yeah.
which also has its own set of challenges and considerations as well.
I mean, that is the foundation of the allopathic model is risk mitigation and yeah, control, like domination in a way, right? So not necessarily like there's not a lot of finesse there for the most part, at least with most practitioners in that model. It is really about how can we get this particular outcome using the tools that we have, which are drugs and other possibly even surgical interventions, whatever that looks like. So there is this kind of framework, or you could say like it's a belief system that you have to opt into, or most of us are already born sort of opted into it because of the cultural context we live in. And that is that you can even control the body. Can you really control the body? Like we have to already believe that you can control the body, right? And I think for a lot of women who are on a motherhood journey, we could say, so that includes fertility, at some point, whether it's birth or fertility or in the postpartum time, we all have to reckon with the fact that we are not in control, that this is something that is bigger than we are. And whether maybe that's not until you have a toddler and you're like, wow, I really just can't control what this person is doing anymore. And they are their own person, right? So maybe it's that. Maybe it is in birth, right? Where it's so big and it really has its own trajectory that is outside of your control. And we all have to contend with that. How does it feel for us in a somatic way to lose control? And I think that's where a lot of women are sort of hooked into that system, is just lack of capacity to be with the sensations associated with being out of control, with not having the ultimate say, or with recognizing that it might not go the way you anticipated. And that we sort of get into that framework. It's like when you choose that path of assisted reproductive technology, IVF, you are saying, okay, I believe that this situation can be controlled in a way, and I'm going to try to control it to the degree that I get the outcome that I want. But I think what the shadow side of that, and there's not a lot of upfront or openness about, is that IVF is actually, it's not even that successful,
Mm.
and it's really hard to find clear statistics on IVF. And that's for a lot of reasons. So you could go through the CDC, you could go through different clinics, but in reality, it's like we still have to contend with the fact that there is this chance that you won't get the outcome that you want, regardless of what you do. And I think that is obviously the underground or the underbelly of the whole industry.
Yeah, that actually made me think of a woman I was talking with the other day, where she had in her mind that she was getting too old. Okay.
Yeah.
And very accomplished, very smart professional. She had it in her head because, they tell us after 35 we're too old to do anything. Or we have a lot of escalated risk because you're after 35. And so she went the IVF route for her first child because she was kind of pushed into it with this narrative that you're talking about. And she also had this underlying feeling of the clock is ticking, so I need to control the outcome, right? And she had her first child. I guess it was a pretty rigorous journey through IVF. And then a couple of years later, she naturally conceived. So almost 43 years old, she naturally conceived her second child and had a completely different experience with her journey through pregnancy, her birth, her recovery afterwards, because she didn't have all of the, I'm going to call it the mechanistic
Yeah.
supports that you have through the ART procedure process, because her body did all of this organically and naturally. I'm going to pause this incredible episode to share an opportunity for you to join me as a reproductive rebel. As you know, I'm a holistic women's health practitioner who practices with a focus in East Asian medicine. I truly am one of a kind in the way that I practice, and that is a part of what makes me a rebel. I am here to disrupt a healthcare model for women and provide natural and effective solutions for all phases in a woman's life. Do you feel called to make a difference in women's health? Whether you are already a practitioner working in this space, wishing to add to your toolkit, or you are just a passionate rebel with a calling to make a difference for others, as I was at the start of my career in this field, the Holistic Women's Health Practitioner Program is open for enrollment. I am looking for passionate, committed, and heart centered people who desire to make a difference in the women's health space and desire to make it a place where women feel seen and heard, where their needs and concerns aren't gaslit, but really taken seriously and met with compassion and education to help them reach their goals. Does this sound like you? If so, please check out the program link in the show notes and schedule a one-on-one talk with me or join a free information session. Or if you know that without a doubt this is where you want to go, enroll and get started today. Together, we will make a difference for the future of women's healthcare. I can't wait for you to join me. And now, back to the show.
Yeah. I mean, those stories are so needed for other women to hear of what's possible because you can really get in this mindset or in this sort of, it's almost like a pattern or like a somatic experience of like, it's just like you have your blinders on and it's like, this is the way I have to do it. Right.
Yeah.
It's only this way. Otherwise, it's never going to work.
Yeah.
And when we start to hear, oh, here's someone who got pregnant at 42 without medication, or, oh, this woman like had failed IVF, but then she got pregnant naturally. These stories can be really, really impactful.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think even just people who are conceiving after 35, just that in itself, those
Yeah.
stories are huge because, again, it's all part of the storyline, which creates the urgency and this feeling that we need to control this process when, you made such a beautiful point that we really can't control the entire process because at some point surrender is going to be required. You had a post the other day that I thought was really beautiful, and you were talking about the statistic that you find quite shocking is less than 2% of births in the United States happen at home. And then you went on to talk about the whole birthing process itself. So when we talk about there being aspects to not controlling the process, would you speak a little bit to that particular post? I loved it and I was going to share it.
Yeah, of course. So now we're kind of stepping out of that model completely, right? So the way that I've personally approached the pregnancy and birthing process is with my first. I knew I wanted to have a home birth, and I thought, okay, you hire a home birth midwife. That's sort of what you do if you're having a home birth. So I did that, and I had a great experience overall. However, as I started moving through that process, it was like, oh, what my vision or my expectation of a midwife was kind of different than what I got, and not in a bad way necessarily, but I had started to see how the medical industry had kind of infiltrated the midwifery model. And so it was like, oh, I'm still getting sort of the same standardized prenatal care that I got or that I would potentially get with an OB. Of course, it was way better and I could opt out of anything and I had, a lot better care and support. But I started to question that, and I questioned it especially at the end of my pregnancy, that first pregnancy, because of the state regulations in the state I was living in at the time, which is California. There were a lot of reasons why if I went into labor at a certain gestation or if I was in labor too long or other XYZ happened, my midwife would not be able to attend. And so then I was like, oh no, I'm not going to go to the hospital. Let's say I start or I'm in labor at 36 weeks. I'm not going to go to the hospital, but my midwife can't come. So like, what is that? What's going to happen there? So that really led me to this path of one, just taking responsibility. And that was scary for me as a first-time mom of like, well, maybe in a certain situation, I might birth on my own. Not completely on my own. I had my partner and I had a doula who knew that, I would be making potentially some radical choices, and she was okay with that. But it really made me confront like the taking responsibility for my own experience part, which I think a lot of the medical model, whether it's in midwifery or with an obstetrician, it is about letting some of that responsibility go or outsourcing it in some way of like, okay, well, I know they're going to tell me if something's wrong, and I'm going to use an ultrasound to tell me if something's wrong. Or this is going to be the thing that tells me if something's wrong, rather than going inside and saying, no, I will know if something's wrong. And even taking it a step beyond, the part that's really tricky and where I support women like through the pregnancy processes, I will know if something's wrong, and I have the capacity to get help when I need it, right?
Mm.
So I have the capacity to figure out, oh, I need help, or, oh, this is what I need next in those particular, maybe it's a sticky situation or whatever the case is. So I think moving into the birthing portal or birthing realm, for a lot of women, this is when we contend with that sense of control and the illusion, we could say, that the technocratic model provides.
Mhm.
And that is the illusion of control, because it's not actually control. There's lots of studies and research to back up that ultrasounds actually, they don't improve outcomes. They don't improve outcomes for mothers or babies, but we still are so, so deeply attached to them culturally. And a lot of women will tell me, well, it just gives me a lot of reassurance, right? Reassurance that my baby's okay. And for me, I understand that logically, but the way I approach it is, of course, I could get an ultrasound today. I'm pregnant. I'm about 16 weeks. And it would tell me that my baby's alive right now and seems to be doing pretty well. But it doesn't really tell me anything about what I would consider like markers of vitality for that child. Or if it, let's say something looks off, then it's just going to lead me to more testing and sort of lead me into that fear. And I call it like
Mhm.
a fear matrix. Once you're in that fear matrix, and I've seen a lot of women be in that, it's really hard to get out, because then you're seeing the maternal fetal specialist, and then you're going to ultrasounds every other week. And it's just a check, and it's, oh, we just got to keep checking. And
Mhm.
it's like, what are we doing? What are
Mhm.
we're perpetuating the fear, and that actually has a physical impact in the mother's body of creating more cortisol production and increasing the stress that that baby's experiencing. And we have to understand that when we opt into these things, there are risks associated with them. Of course, when we opt out, there are also risks associated with that. So we all have to be sort of eyes open when it comes to making choices around how we engage with technology and that particular model of care, because there's no risk-free choice.
I love that. Thank you so much for outlining that way, because as you were talking, it makes me think about my own journey. Like, I am opting to use a midwife for my home birthing experience. And I have been very minimal in terms of any sort of intervention and opting out of most things. But I did opt to have the anatomy scan done at 20 weeks. And I don't know whether they actually saw something or they just saw my age on a chart,
Mm.
but they went, "You need to go see the MFM, the maternal
Oh
fetal medicine
gosh,
specialist."
yeah.
Yep. And so he had his heart scan done because they were concerned that he might have myocarditis, and
Okay.
he's fine. He's
Yeah.
fine. And I kept saying to my husband, I'm like, I've had enough experience with pregnancy loss in the past. Every single time I felt off, there was just something that didn't feel right. I couldn't put my finger on it. I didn't feel sick per se, but I didn't
Right.
feel like myself. And I feel fine. He feels fine. We're going to be fine. And it was. Everything was fine. But we're not encouraged to trust that body wisdom. especially when it comes to the birthing process. I read this beautiful book. It's called Childbirth is a Rite of Passage by Rachel Reed.
Yeah,
And
I know that book.
I mean, it's very eye-opening in terms of how many different ways our body wisdom gets challenged, and that the narrative structures things as you are lacking, and I'm using air quotes, or deficient somehow, and that the technology model has to step in to quote unquote fix you.
Yeah,
And
it's
that
so strange.
it's so strange, and it resonated so deeply with me. And then as I've been going through this journey as somebody who is now in her 40s and has a healthy 24-week pregnancy at this point, like, just look at that and I have come up against my own set of challenges with a system that is trying to force me into that fear model that you were talking about. And it did. I have to
Of
say,
course.
I
I
I
would be the
absolutely
same way.
I absolutely fell for it. For about a week and a half, I was like, I feel like my baby's fine, but they're telling me he's not fine. I need to rule out the fact that he's fine, right? And when I walked away from that appointment, I was so mad at myself because I'm like, he's fine. I knew he was fine. Why did I let
Yeah.
them stress me out like that? But it did. It took a lot out of me. But I refused to go back and they want me to go back every month.
Yeah,
But
they want you
I
to go and keep doing the monitoring and all of that.
No, and I'm not doing it. I'm going to go back and have a check for Previa at 34 weeks, but I'm
That's
not,
it, yeah.
like I'm not putting him through that because it's not good for him either.
Right, yeah, this is not even getting into, like, the ultrasound, how that might impact, like, the growing baby, but how it impacts moms. I think
Mhm.
it's so clear. It's so, so clear. And of course, you're going to feel stress about someone telling you there's something wrong with your baby. I mean, that is very, very expected and normal. It would be odd if you didn't feel that, right?
Yeah.
And that's the part where I just don't understand sort of the level of disembodiment that happens is like that model. And I'm not pointing out to particular practitioners within that model, but just the model in general is set up so that it's trying to really rip women apart from their intuition when they're approaching a time where they actually need their intuition to be intact more
Mhm.
than ever. And there's a midwife called Sister Morningstar, and she's been practicing for a very long time. And she calls this instinct injury, right? It's like we go into birth in many situations with our natural instincts being injured from this particular approach. And that doesn't even have to happen during your pregnancy. That could be because you were told at 15 that you have PCOS and you're always going to have it and you need to do this and you have to be on hormonal birth control. It could be for a lot of different reasons. Maybe you had a pap smear that was really just not embodied or not, yeah, just not good. There's lots of reasons why our instincts get injured. And that is primarily within this, like we were speaking to before, the control model of like,
Mhm.
something outside of myself needs to control, manage, fix something inside. And birth, pregnancy, it's really a time where you need to be deeply in touch with that inner knowing or with that intuition and with your instincts so you can come through the birthing portal intact.
Mhm. Well, and it's so funny because there's this micromanagement that happens in the pregnancy and birthing phase, and then we're left to the wild.
Yeah.
The full spot.
Yeah, and then in the postpartum time, it's like, here, okay, your pelvic floor looks okay. It's like pretty much together. That's all I can tell. And then, do you need antidepressant? That's pretty much standard, offered at 6 weeks if you're seeing an obstetrician. And here's some low dose hormonal birth control. And
Mm.
like, that's it. Like, that's the common sort of 6 week checkup scheme, you could call it. But it shifts because then it's all about the baby, and the baby has to go do the checkups, and the baby needs to do this and that, and the baby needs to be injected, and the baby needs to be weighed. And so it's still there. It's just centered around the baby, and the mother who should be centered in the situation is just sort of a appendage or a way for the baby to survive in a way, which
Mhm.
is so like dehumanizing and a lot of other things that tells us a lot about the culture in general of how we view mothers and families too.
Mhm.
But yeah, that's just an interesting turn that it takes in the postpartum time.
Yeah, and all the physical demands that bringing baby for set appointments takes on mom's body too. I mean, this is one of the things that I think is so beautiful about traditional Chinese medicine view of the postpartum experience is like you should be spending your time in bed
Yeah.
and resting and eating certain things and really replenishing the fact that you are probably the emptiest that your body will ever be at that particular moment and honoring the fact that it took you this amount of time to build this little human, that it's not going to be an Amazon Prime kind of fix, and you're not going to be right back to your pre-pregnancy genes necessarily immediately afterwards. Some people can, but like for the vast majority of people, you end up fighting feelings around body dysmorphia. My body doesn't look or feel the way that it did before. I don't have the energy. My body is, my life is demanding more of my body than my body can handle right now. Yet I have to take this little person to have their lip and tongue tie investigated and this and
Yeah.
that and all of these things. And it's, we really should be focusing more of that attention on that postpartum recovery.
Totally. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I feel very fortunate that I kind of had that education, I think, because of my background in Chinese medicine before I had my first. So I really just tried to set myself up for success. So, I had my mom come stay with us, and that was really helpful. And then I had meals that I had prepared and frozen, and then meals that were brought from family and friends. And then I had a postpartum doula too. And even with that, it's still a big transition and it still felt like a lot. And I still had certain challenges with breastfeeding that I needed to navigate and other things. So there's still a lot of recovery that has to happen. But I can't imagine like trying to be up and doing things and all of that with like a newborn.
That's actually how I started in Chinese medicine. Was I had a horrible postpartum recovery because with my first child, I didn't know what I didn't know.
Yeah,
And
of
so many people
course.
don't. And I wasn't nourishing myself the right way, and I was struggling with milk supply and didn't have any help. I didn't even know a postpartum doula existed. Again, why this program exists to raise awareness around things like this for people who might not know that these are tools that could really truly benefit the outcome of their recovery process, but also their baby's development
Hmm.
because this is where mom and baby bond.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much imprinting that happens in that initial postpartum time of stress or of ease, of nourishment or lack of nourishment, rest or hurrying through something. So it is really a special time. And if you're able to even just take that next step towards more rest, more nutrient dense foods, it's definitely the long-term gains are so big.
Oh, absolutely. That's one thing I'm actually really looking forward to with this pregnancy. I've waited many years for him to come into being. And now that he is here, being able to savor and enjoy that time and not feel rushed through that time because I'm
Mhm.
listening to what the meta narrative is telling me rather than really listening to what I feel in the deepest parts of my body, which is really beautiful. So I could talk to you about this forever. Thank you so, so much for coming on the show and talking about these super important topics with me. If people are looking to connect with you, I know you have a lot of really great offerings and one that's actually opening up right now. So if you'd like to talk about that a little bit and how people can find you, Kristen.
Yeah, of course. The best way is just to go to my website, wombmedicine.com. or you can come over on Instagram and say hello. I'm just at Kristin Hauser, so it's just my name, pretty easy to find. Yeah, I always have a lot of things going on, but generally it's structured around either fertility and menstrual care. So I'll be launching or starting a new program called Fertile Woman Academy this summer. I'm really excited about that. So that's specific for women who are struggling with fertility. Maybe they've had previous losses and they're wanting to get pregnant again, or they've had failed IVF, failed IUIs, and they want to find a different approach. So I'll be hosting a free class about that coming up in July. You can also join me if you're here for like the birth and pregnancy stuff. I have a collective called the Vital Pregnancy Collective, and you can join that anytime. I host monthly master classes in there and a community forum and Q&A and things like that. So those are the main ways to work with me right now. And yeah, just thank you so much for having me on.
Well, all of the information about how to contact Kristin will be in the show note. Thank you again so much for joining me on this show. And we'll have to do this again soon.
Sounds good. Yeah, maybe during the postpartum time for both of us.
I'd love that.
All right, take care.
You as well. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Reproductive Rebel. Reproductive Rebel is recorded by certified peri-steam hydrotherapist and acutonics practitioner, herbalist, and Chinese nutritional therapist Adrienne Irizarry of Moon Essence LLC. If you are interested in setting up an appointment for one-on-one support, ordering from our store, or checking out our course offerings, visit our website at moonessence.life. Be sure to subscribe to our newsletter and get insider information on upcoming events and offerings. Join the conversation. Like and follow us at MoonEssenceMe on Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. Your voices make this program possible. Thank you all for your continued support.